Have you ever wanted to make natural terrain in Pkxd like a pro? If yes, or if you just want to watch the video, then this video is for you. Anyway, I'll show you how to build natural terrain like a pro. So let's get started. First, you are going to want to figure out where you're going to build your terrain. Here are some recommendations on where to build it. You can build your terrain in the small giant robot house, the admin house, the loft house, or an XP island. Those are just my recommendations, so you can totally build your terrain anywhere you want. Now I'll actually show you how to build natural terrain. First of all, I'll show you how to make the ground look good. By the way, for the ground, you can use the green block or the island item. I'll be using the island item for this example, and your terrain doesn't have to have a custom made ground like this terrain. The first tip is to make lively grass. To do that, I use this item, and then I merge it in the ground to where only the leaves are showing. You can also add tiny plants and items to make the ground more interesting to look at. Sadly, the flower item I'm using can't be used inside houses since it's in the garden category. Anyway, enough rambling from me, let's work on the plants now. First, we'll talk about trees. The first tip about trees is to not use for trees that each have a different color on them. For example, avoid using different colors of trees, like these trees combined. But if you pick trees that are around the same color, like the red and pink tree, then those trees will look a lot better when they're together. The second tip is to not use one type of tree. That's because if you use only one type of tree, then your terrain might look stale and less interesting to look at. But this tip won't work out if you use trees that have significant differences of color. The third tip is if you're trying to make natural terrain with not a lot of trees, then spread your trees out. That's because if all of your trees are in one spot, then it won't look very realistic. But if they're spread out, then your natural terrain will look more realistic. Now, let's talk about greenery. First of all, I like to put plants next to my trees. I'm going to place these two items next to one of my trees. Also, for each kind of tree I'm using, I'll place at least one different plant next to my tree to keep my trees and greenery from being repetitive. I also make sure to change the direction of some plants to not make them repetitive as well. Speaking of greenery, I merge bigger plants into the ground too. I merge them to where only the leaves are showing, or in this item's case, hide the brown platform the plants are on. Also, I place more plants and items between the trees to make it more interesting to look at. I added some butterflies by the way. Anyway, now let's talk about how to build cliffs. First of all, I use the gray blocks to make my cliffs. Now, the first tip is to not make your cliffs perfect. Instead, have parts of the cliff stick out, come in, and change direction. The second tip is to build your cliffs in layers. For example, this cliff has 4 layers. I recommend to make your cliffs 3 or 4 layers high. Now, if you want to see how I make my cliffs, then here is a quick speed build of the first 2 layers of a cliff I'm making. Now, I will show you how I add grass on my cliffs. By the way, I use green blocks to make the grass on my cliffs. First of all, I lift up a green block to the top of my cliff. Then I merge the green block into where only this much of it shows. Then when I place the green blocks, I leave some space for the rock of the cliff to show. By the way, if you ever run into this problem where part of the grass is poking out, but when you move it where you want the grass to be, the green block sticks out like this, then just place another gray block to cover it. After using most of the tips in this video, this is what my cliff looks like. Next, let's talk about decorations. Here are some tips about incorporating items with your natural terrain. The first tip is to use items in different ways. For example, I'm using these wooden tables to form a pathway to a water source. And the last tip for decorating your natural terrain is to use items and merge them into the ground to only be able to see certain things. For example, I merged a wreath into the ground so only the items would be shown. By the way, putting plants next to your decorations will make your natural terrain look more overgrown. This is what my natural terrain looks like after applying almost all the tips from this video. Last but not least, I'll show you how to make waterfalls and more. Firstly, I'll teach you how to make waterfalls. How I make waterfalls is that I build it in layers. I make the bottom layer, the second layer, etc. And when I make a new layer, I make it go back a bit. I usually make it go back this much. You can also make the layers on your waterfall diagonal by turning part of the layers a certain way. Anyway, now I'll tell you how to add water to make rivers, oceans, etc. How I do this is that I actually add a bunch of the blue carpet item and merge it into the ground to where you can only see the blue part of the carpet. But using these items can get pretty expensive, so I have some cheaper alternatives of both items on the screen. Anyway, I also forgot to mention, I used the blue fridge item for making the waterfall in this video. Last but not least, you can add the cloud item and the item that shoots bubbles to make your waterfalls look more lively. So here is what my waterfall looks like. Anyway, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Goodbye.